These are the oligarchical financial families. They run British intelligence. They have run the State Department here and our secret intelligence agencies. But that's being changed. And it's a war. We'll see what happens. It's a war.
Yes, it
We have
is.
to clean them out before they kill our president.
That's right.
And and in this connection, Ukraine is functioning as a proxy for British intelligence. Now, we put out an excellent dossier, 25-page dossier, called Police Dossier. It is the British who kill American presidents.
Hello and welcome to Take Control of Your Liberty with Scott Tregurtha, where we help critical thinkers by giving you the most true and accurate information we can find, which they should be giving you on mainstream media, but are not. So you can decide for yourself and take control of your liberty, your freedom, and your future. And now, here is Scott Tregurtha.
Hello, everybody. The fact of the matter is, regarding the Russian-Ukraine war, we have only been hearing one side of it. And I don't care if you get your news from the liberal lamestream media or the so-called conservative media. Every single one of them makes Putin out to be the villain in all this. When, for example, Ukraine was shelling and killing Russians in the Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine well before Putin invaded, and was one of the reasons he invaded, i.e., to rescue those people, believe it or not. And that's just one example of that of which we have not been told. So watch, listen, and learn as my next guest, Jim Duree, from the best news source and activist group I know, really does give us the rest of the story. Hey, Jim, welcome back to Take Control of Your Liberty.
Hi, Scott. Thanks for having me on.
Very happy to have you. I figure maybe we can get to the bottom of some things that the news isn't telling us.
I'm sure we
Now,
can. Mhm.
I'll bet we can. And the biggest thing I've been coming to you for is answers on what's going on in this Ukraine-Russo war. Now, according to the news, every outlet I've ever looked at for months has been, they're acting like we got to do all kinds of stuff to get Putin to come to the negotiating table to end this thing. And I've heard, when I listen to Putin directly on anything, like Tucker Carlson's interview and some other things, different news reports and things like that, not mainstream at all. They're saying he's wants to talk. He wants to handle this thing. So can you tell us why we're getting such a diversion here and what's really going on?
Yeah, I can. Um, as I think I indicated in my earlier program with you many months ago, the first thing everyone has to realize about this crisis is that everything you think you know about it, about the Ukraine conflict and so on, is a lie. It's a deliberate lie. In fact, you might say it's a neo-Nazi lie, because the people promoting the lies are the people who started this conflict, and their policy is to destroy both the United States and Russia. And I'm referring to the British Empire, or more broadly, as President Trump has correctly stated it, the globalist predatory financial class. They're the people behind the intent to pit the US versus the Russian Federation, and much worse than that. So, just to give you an illustration of the specific matter you mentioned, whether Putin wants to come to the table or not, if people think back, well, you may not be able to think back to the period before this conflict broke out in February of 2022, because the media coverage then was at least as outrageously lying as it is now. But the truth of the matter is that Russia went out of its way publicly to demand negotiations with the US, Ukraine, and so on to resolve the crisis then, because the Russian-speaking Ukrainians in the Donbass were being shelled routinely, that is, the civilians, murdered by Zelensky's Ukrainian forces, and the Russians didn't like that.
And they were Russians getting bombarded, right?
They were Russian-speaking Ukrainians then.
Mhm.
Now they're Russians. Those areas are part of Russia now. They voted to join Russia. In fact,
Right.
they voted a long time ago to join Russia. But this goes back to 2014, 2013 into 2014, which is when Barack Obama, his Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, Victoria Nuland, you may have heard of her, and a fellow
Absolutely.
named Christopher Steele of
Mhm.
British intelligence collaborated to overthrow the legitimate government of Ukraine. What had happened is that Viktor Yanukovych, who was then the elected president of Ukraine, it was internationally recognized as the legitimate president of Ukraine, um, was the subject of a so-called color revolution run under Obama to violently remove him and to launch a civil war in Ukraine with the particular aim of conducting ethnic cleansing against the Russian-speaking Ukrainians who lived principally in southeastern Ukraine for literally hundreds of years. Okay, these people have been living there, speaking Russian, many of them knowing Ukrainian too, nominally, in the recent period, Ukrainian uh, citizens, but being of Russian ethnic extraction. Also, people should realize, during World War II, our war propaganda, US war propaganda, stressed that Ukraine was just little Russia. Of course, it was a state, a socialist republic within the USSR. But this idea of historical conflict between Ukrainians and Russians, it's just a bunch of nonsense. This is something made up by the people who want these kinds of conflicts around the world. Now, so what happened in the period after this coup d'etat, which Obama conducted, and British intelligence? Oh, I should mention this fellow Christopher Steele. People may remember that name.
Right.
He provided about 50 memoranda to Victoria Nuland on how to conduct this neo-Nazi coup d'etat in Ukraine against President Yanukovych. Now, let me make sure you understand what I mean by the term neo-Nazi, because if you go back to World War II and the prelude to that in Ukraine and in Poland, there was an entity there run by Stepan Bandera, which was a branch of Hitler's Waffen-SS.
Right.
Okay, this is the Union of Ukrainian Nationalists. This was the Galician Division, so-called. There's a more or less rather vague geographical area there between Poland, eastern Poland, and northwestern Ukraine called Galicia. You'll see it on some maps. It does not have a firm boundary. That was called the Galician region, and that's where the Banderas were based. These guys even set up their own division, military division, and went to North Africa to fight with Hitler's people against us. Later, those warriors were diverted from where they should have gone, that is, to a prisoner of war camp to be interrogated for their war crimes. They were sent by British intelligence to Canada to be embedded in the large Ukrainian diaspora population there in Canada. Some here too, some in this area. Now, but the point of it is, these guys were Nazis. They murdered probably 100,000 Polish Catholics, uh, Ukrainian, Russian, Belarusian Jews, and others. There's no doubt that that occurred. It's a big
For what
tragedy.
purpose? Why?
Why did Hitler murder the Jews?
Insanity.
He didn't like Jews. He didn't like human beings. He didn't like Russians. The point of it is these folks conducted these kinds of mass murders in uh, principally in northwestern, what is now northwestern Ukraine. I've seen videos of the Polish Catholic Church conducting memorial marches in these areas for the Polish Catholics slaughtered by these Ukrainian Nazis way back then. But the the post-coup Ukrainian regime, first Poroshenko and now, of course, Zelensky, they worship these Nazis. And people can say, oh, Zelensky is a Jew. He's not a Jew. I may be ethnically Jewish. The guy was a third-rate TV performer, pressed into service to run for president. The moment he got in there, and he got in there because he was supposedly against the civil war then raging, he turned tail and backed the Nazis. I mean, the Ukrainian Nazis. And what's been going on ever since that period. But again, back to the question of whether Putin wants to negotiate. The Russians were everywhere demanding negotiations about this situation in southeastern Ukraine. They laid out what their security guarantees were, and beyond the question of protecting these ethnic Russians, their concern is having NATO in Ukraine. Because if anybody remembers the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Soviet dictator Nikita Khrushchev, put Soviet intermediate range missiles, nuclear tipped missiles in Cuba, maybe 100 of them or more, and we ultimately figured that out using our U-2 planes and so on. We nearly had a nuclear war. Kennedy mobilized his country and demanded that those missiles be pulled out. And Kennedy was right. What the Russians fear is a Cuban Missile Crisis in reverse,
Right.
and they should. See, back at the end of the Soviet Union, um, what happened is that the US, British, and so on proposed to Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the final dictator of the Soviet Union, they proposed to him that if the Soviets would allow the peaceful reunification of Germany. Remember, Germany was still divided into 3 parts or 4 parts, French, British, Russian, or Soviet, and US, okay? That if the Soviets would allow the peaceful reunification of the Soviet Union, NATO would never expand to the east, not 1 inch.
Right.
That was a firm agreement, and it was a complete fraud, a complete lie. And since that period, NATO has added at least 16 people, and they may add 16 countries, pardon me. Um, People need to realize that several years within a couple of years of Putin becoming acting president of the Russian Federation in 1999, he was actively organizing for Russia, the Russian Federation, to join NATO. Most people don't understand that. He was making the big bid to be reincorporated into the so-called West. That was turned down. There was no basis for not having Russia join us in various alliances of that nature, except one, which is the British don't want the US to work with Russia because their plan, their globalist plan, involves preventing particularly the big sovereign nation states from working with each other properly. These guys are into global dictatorship, global Malthusianism, that is cuts in population, global environmentalism that is against advanced science and technology, and even worse than that. So, um,
And they don't want these sovereign nations working with each other because they operate on divide and conquer, right?
yes,
They
yes,
don't want us
precisely.
all. Yeah,
Yes, that's what
right.
they're doing. They're doing it right today, and, I'll give you some illustrations of that. Um, but what has happened in the past, day or 2 is that, there was massive press coverage today in the so-called Western press claiming that, "Oh, Russia attacked Kiev, the, Ukrainian capital yesterday and killed some people, and that this is Putin putting pressure on the US to, this and that and so on, and the US has been pressuring Zelensky, that's bad," and so on. It's all garbage. Russia is just conducting their military campaign as they have been. They had a massive strike yesterday or last night, pardon me, against military and military industrial targets in Ukraine. Some of them undoubtedly around Kiev because there's a lot of industry around Kiev. They did not target civilian populations. And if you look at the claim by Zelensky himself about like the 9 people died and 70 injured, that this was a massive attack. If they'd been attacking civilians, they would have killed a lot of people.
Yeah.
These are I hate to, qualify qualify them as minimal casualties since some people died, but the point is, it's just a lie. Now, what President Trump did is to make a statement saying, "This is not helpful, Vladimir, you gotta stop making these attacks," and so on. But the prelude to that is that Zelensky Zelensky and his owners, his curators, in London and until recently in the US, until President Trump, the new sheriff came into town, they don't want peace. They want war, and they've already murdered over 1,000,000 Ukrainian soldiers in this war.
Right.
Okay, well over 1,000,000, maybe a lot more, and probably about 250 to 300,000 Russian troops. I'm talking dead, I'm talking about killed in action, and
Yep.
probably twice that many on each side injured. And that doesn't count, I mean, all the other collateral damage and so on. But President Trump is correct that this is a hideous war, and it has to be stopped right now. Um, so the truth is, going back to the period before the war, as I mentioned, Putin and Lavrov demanded of this clown Tony Blinken, who was our Secretary of State under the non-existent Joe Biden, and also Powell, who was our national security advisor then, that we negotiate with them on their demands that Ukraine not be allowed into NATO, that Ukraine be neutral like Austria, and that Ukraine be denazified. Now, most people here, since the American media denies the existence of one of the most fundamental aspects of this conflict, which is the dominance by a bunch of neo-Nazis of the regime we have provided what Trump says is $350 billion of US taxpayers' money. Most Americans may not quite understand what I'm talking about. But the truth of the matter is, this is a neo-Nazi government in Ukraine that we're backing, and that, thank God, President Trump is doing something about that. But of course, he has to navigate between the right-wing neocon war hawks on the one side and the liberal democratic war hawks on the other, and while mobilizing his base. So what has happened it is the case that Putin and his team have done everything to work with Trump and his team to negotiate an end to this war. And I go through a couple of the aspects of that, but just in the last day, um, we've had Sergei Naryshkin, who is the director of the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, basically their CIA, on the telephone talking to John Ratcliffe, who was President Trump's CIA director. They had a constructive talk, supposedly, and will meet in person soon. Now, needless to say, nothing like this ever happened under Joe Biden. I don't think it happened under Obama either. But several days ago, around Easter, there was a statement put out which was entitled, Eurofascism is Moscow's and Washington's common enemy, just like 80 years ago. And
Wow.
what is being I can get that to you later, Scott, but what's being talked about is that, France, Germany, and Britain are going fascist. They're backing the war in Ukraine. They won't let Trump and Putin negotiate, a peace settlement. They're arming Ukraine now. We may stop all weapons to, Zelensky soon. And, this guy, Merz, who's the new, incoming chancellor in Germany, says he's gonna transfer these long-range, Taurus, um, air-launched cruise missiles to Ukraine so they can launch attacks deep inside Russia. Now, this is a situation where the power of sovereign nations can come into play. And President Trump, as you know, called Putin on the phone. This is more than a month ago now. And since that time, President Putin has met with Steve Witkoff, who was President Trump's personal emissary, very close to Trump. Um, Kirill Dmitriev of the Russian Direct Investment Fund has come to the U.S. I believe I'm not. He may have met with Trump. I'm not sure. But in any case, there have been a number of these meetings in the Middle East and elsewhere, um, and great progress has been made. And President Trump said today he expects a peace agreement. He also had a row with Zelensky yesterday because Zelensky, in the midst of an impending meeting in London, Zelensky went off and said that Ukraine will never accept Crimea as being part of Russia. Okay? Now, the truth, of course, about Crimea, contrary to the narrative in the American media, is that Crimea has been part of Russia for almost 200 years. Maybe more than 200, 235 is, yeah, 235, since about
The
1780.
people you and didn't you just say the people voted to become part of Russia recently,
Yeah,
right?
what I was referring to was the other, the Donetsk Basin kind regions of southeastern Ukraine. But prior to that, back in 2018, Crimea voted to rejoin Russia, to join the Russian Federation. Mind you, um, well, it's a small history class to give you a sense of this, but about 90% of the, citizens of Crimea are ethnically Russian and consider themselves to be Russians. They've never considered themselves to be Ukrainian. And it was back in 1787 or thereabouts when, uh, the Russian Navy under Catherine the Great, Catherine II, finally was able to liberate Crimea from the Turks, from the Ottoman Turks, because they were running white slavery operations from Crimea into Ukraine and Russia proper. That's what the Turks were doing then. So Russia liberated that area and all of the Black Sea littoral, and then started building cities. City of Odessa, the city of Kherson, city of Mariupol, Melitopol, and many, many others in that area, including up the Dnieper River, are Russian cities. Odessa is a Russian city. So that gives you a little flavor, of the situation.
Right,
So
and why is Zelensky so adamant about giving up Crimea?
well, look, Zelensky doesn't have principles.
Right?
He's a drug addict, and he follows orders from principally London and from some of the extremist circles, around him. what's going on in the world now is we have a president. We didn't have a president until November or until January 20th here when Trump was inaugurated.
Right.
President Trump is genuinely committed to securing peace there and also in the Middle East around Gaza and so on. And he is acting on his campaign promises to do that. There is massive opposition to him from this globalist crew and their tentacles into places like the New York Times or the Times of London, the BBC, and so on. And they continue to lie in all directions to try to screw this up, including making up falsehoods about the actual character of President Trump's contacts with the Russians. There was by the way, President Trump made a comment today, which I thought was very interesting. He was talking about at the White House with reporters. Well, what are the Russians going to give up to make peace in this thing? And what Trump said is, well, one of the things they're going to give up is that they're going to agree to end this war. Now, if you roll that over in your mind a little bit, think about what this means. What he's saying is that Russia's won the war, that Russia's already defeated these clowns in Ukraine, and that giving up that victory in exchange for a peace agreement,
Giving up what now?
giving up
Oh,
that victory by Russia, having them give that up is certainly a concession. Now, now Trump is saying this probably a bit tongue in cheek, but you may remember that yesterday Trump put a statement on Truth Social on his personal, you know, social media account in which he blasted Zelensky for sabotaging the peace agreement or trying to sabotage the peace agreement. This is a question you're asking about why Zelensky is fixated on Crimea. And what Trump said in part in that statement is, look, Zelensky can have peace, or he can fight for 3 more years and lose his entire country.
right.
That was President Trump who said that.
I remember that.
And that's a very useful thing to think about. Now, the Russians are putting out reports by people like this Sergei Narishkin, who I said was meeting our CIA director, or was talking to him on the phone. But these Russian reports document the efforts of France and Britain in particular to lie about all these things, to sabotage the ongoing negotiations, not just on Ukraine, but the potential normalization of relations between the US and Russia. So this is an extremely interesting situation, very dangerous, but also very promising because we have a president. We didn't have a president before, and Obama was even worse. So we have a president, we have a secretary of defense, we have a secretary of state, we have a head of intelligence and a CIA director and a defense secretary who are American patriots and they are loyal to Donald Trump. So this is a situation where the forces of patriotism and reason can potentially prevail. That's, well, as the president likes to say, that's a good thing, not a bad
It
thing.
very good thing, and it's the first time I can remember it being this good since in my lifetime, really.
Mhm.
It's even way better than the way Reagan had it. But uh, so why are we getting the idea that Putin is resistant to coming to the table? I mean, I hear these I can't remember all their names, but they are big names, neocons, interviewed on conservative news stations. They're saying we have to increase pressure on Putin to come to the table. Is that just not true? That
Well,
he
you're supposed to believe that.
Yeah, he wants to come to the table, right?
Well, he doesn't wanna come to the table.
Oh, he
He's
does not
been
wanna come.
he's been at the table the entire time, okay?
Okay.
Okay? It's all bullshit. And pitting the US against Russia has been one of the most fundamental bedrock principles of the British Empire going back 200 plus years. I'll give you one illustration here. I've got a very interesting article here. Uh,
Yeah, I know that's how they operate.
yeah,
So that is just them doing what they do. Um,
yes, but it's more than
yeah.
that. Look,
Uh-huh.
it's called evil. Look, we launched this country on the basis of a principle which is complete anathema to the British Empire, the Dutch Empire before it, the Venetian Empire, the Roman Empire, the Phoenician Empire, Babylon. The principle is that all men are created equal.
Right.
That principle is a complete revolution in human affairs.
Right.
There was never a time when a nation would be built on that principle, but we did. And that's what people need to realize. In the British Empire today, look, at the end of World War II, we'd won the wars. We and the Soviets had won the wars. The Soviets coming from the east, and the U.S. Army from the west, meeting. Um, I think tomorrow was the anniversary of the meeting between the U.S. Army and the Soviet Red Army at the Elbe River, Torgau, in Germany, on the way to Berlin. Both of us, of course, were headed to Berlin to finish the European side of the war. But the British have always insisted that the US must be enemies of the Russians. If you go back to the Revolutionary War period, it happens to be the case that Benjamin Franklin was in contact with the Russian Academy of Sciences. This is under Tsarina Catherine the Great. And that Benjamin Franklin orchestrated a principle which became known as the Treaty of the League of Armed Neutrality. You've heard of that. It was the agreement which was promulgated by the Tsarina and effectively enforced, which prohibited any country in Europe from coming to the aid of the British in their attempt to crush the America. We weren't the United States yet. Now that was not,
Did Russia create that?
yes. Yeah, well, mind you, Ben Franklin created it, but we got the Russians to adopt it and promulgate it.
Adopted it.
Yes, the guy. In fact, I've got an article on it here, quite interesting. Anyway, the point is that there is a positive basis, potentially, between a agreements between the US and Russia on all manner of things, including the threat of nuclear war. We already have, um, Witkoff and other Americans negotiating with the Russian Direct Investment Fund to reopen U.S. Oil companies' access to Siberia in Russia. And they're talking about all kinds of joint economic development. That's a good thing. That's a very good thing. And
Absolutely.
so now the point of it is, um, President Trump just said that the next few days, literally the next few days, are going to be crucial for getting a settlement of this situation in Ukraine. I'm sure he's telling the truth. And I think people should have some sense now about what's really going on there. I know it's complex, but in the final analysis, it's not that complex.
Well, it never is as complex as those instigating it want you to feel that it is, right? Uh, Most things are simple till these guys get involved in it and make it complicated. Um, so basically, the bottom line answer to my question is, uh, it's all bullshit as far as Putin being resistant on coming to the table.
Yes.
He's at the table,
That's correct. Go ahead.
and this is the feeling I've gotten all along. I mean, it wasn't just intuition. It was like, this is what I've been seeing. It always feels like it's intuition because they're all saying something different is happening. And yet what I see and hear, it is happening. And I can see Zelensky being the resistant one as a total pawn of the British or the oligarchs or whatever people are happy describing these bastards as. He's the pawn in there, keep doing everything he can to keep peace from happening because he wants that money to keep rolling.
Yeah, he also knows that if there's peace, there will be elections in Ukraine.
Then he's gone.
He's got about 4% popular support there right now, and it's gonna be over for him. It turns out also that, uh, reportedly at least, that Zelensky's private security guard is all British, like British special forces type people. That's the impression I've received. So he may also realize that if he bucked them to try to make peace, he might not be around for too long.
Because all they got to do is remove his security and he's dead.
Yeah, yeah, although his the people made the people who would carry out the problem may be his security. So they may not remain his security.
Well, there's that. Yeah, right. I mean, to me, the way I look at it is so many people hate him that you pull away the security, it's automatic. They're going to
Yeah,
zoom
yeah,
in.
sure, sure.
It's
Yeah, I
like
know
a bunch of
yeah, you're right.
sharks
Yeah. Now
swarming. You know,
one of the other aspects of this, which is worth mentioning, is that worth eh, worth mentioning, particularly in terms of understanding the propaganda which claims Putin doesn't want to come to the table. This war was fought over NATO expanding eastward to the Russian border, and secondly, over this neo-Nazi coup d'état, which put these clowns in control of Ukraine, who were killing the ethnic Russians. And they said early on, "Oh, you can't speak Russian anymore in Ukraine," blah blah blah, and that led to that civil war. Now, um, the Russians are not going to agree to a so-called peace agreement, which fails to deal with these problems, because
ah,
there'll be
yeah.
another war next year. The Russians had been involved um, back in the 2015 to 18 period in defending the people of the Donbass, the Donetsk basin in southeastern Ukraine, which is heavily Russian, ethnically Russian. And what ultimately occurred is that the Donbass militias there uh, fought the Ukrainian military to a standstill, and a temporary ceasefire was set up, and an agreement for that ceasefire was called the Minsk Agreement, negotiated in Belarus's capital, Minsk. Now, that agreement involved Germany, it involved Russia, it involved the Ukrainians, obviously, the Donbassers, and us, as I recall. But in any case, it was an agreement for people to stay in place, and it was to lead to negotiations for autonomy for these areas which had been attacked by the Ukrainian military, but they would stay within Ukraine. Those areas would remain Ukrainian, they would remain Ukrainian citizens, but they would be allowed to speak Russian, and so on. Now, that agreement was implemented, but it really wasn't implemented because it was used as a cover for massive armament of Ukraine, to the point that the war could break out later. The Russians point to that now and saying, why would we agree to something that when we've already been stabbed in the back? They look the same
Right.
way at the NATO eastward expansion when the Soviets had agreed that or I should say that NATO had agreed to not expand to the east, but they did anyway. So, that's why Putin said when Trump called him and the articles about it appeared in the press, that yes, Russia wants peace, but we want a ceasefire, but we want a peace based on, solving the root causes of the conflict, okay? Based on the
Right.
okay? Such as I just went through just now. So, it's been a big breakthrough in the past week to have this document I was, uh, quoting from about Eurofascism come out, and to have one of Putin's top, inside advisors, his name is Yuri Ushakov, go on national television in Russia several days ago and say that he's confident that the US administration, that President Trump's administration understands the root causes of the Ukraine conflict. He's saying that Trump understands what they've been talking about, what I've been talking about, but that the decades of anti-Russian hate propaganda make it difficult for President Trump to act on the basis of that understanding. Now, that is an extremely important formulation. It's a total shift in Russian assessments of the U.S., and it's an interesting time frame. I mentioned that the anniversary of our World War II U.S. Army meet up with the Soviet Red Army in on the Elbe River. It's coming up. I think it's tomorrow again. But there's an even bigger anniversary coming up. People may remember that in the past, we here celebrated something called VE Day,
Hmm.
Victory in Europe Day, May 8th. Okay? Most people don't really know much about it anymore, but very important. In Russia, it's called Victory Day or the Day of Victory, and it's on May 9th because when the surrender agreements with Hitler's people were signed in Berlin back on late May 8th, 1945, it was already May 9th in Moscow because they're many hours east, time zones, right? So that's why they celebrate that. That's coming up here soon. There'll be a huge parade in Red Square, and these people, these Russians, are not communists, not at all. But they have the courage. I mean, look, we lost a lot of people in that war.
Yes, we
U.S.
did.
lost about 450,000 people dead in World War II. That's in both theaters, the Asian and European theater. That's a lot of people.
Yes, it
But
is.
that's not what happened with Russia. Russia lost 27,000,000 people.
Oh
Half of
my
to
God.
Hitler, half of them civilians.
Oh man.
You wanna know why the Russians think about this the way they do? You don't have to go too much farther. And when they see Nazis in Kiev, okay, when they see the Germans talking about arming these Nazis, um, President Trump is correct when he says that we're much closer to a global thermonuclear war than people understand.
That certainly makes sense, and
Mhm,
that explains that. Now, one thing is, what is a Nazi?
okay?
People think of not how
No,
people
it's
think
an
of
excellent
Nazis as,
it's an ex it's a
the
that and what is a fascist?
yeah,
Those are excellent questions, principally because the terminology is radically misused by the left here in the US and in Europe, so that they claim everybody they don't like Lyndon LaRouche, who trained me, like Donald Trump and others, are Nazis or racists or whatever, and it's just a complete lie.
right.
It's a complete fraud, and it's deliberate for that matter. And ultimately, you're getting into questions of uh, oligarchical economic policy and the use of cults to create things like Hitler's Nazi Party and so on. But the best way to evaluate who someone really is to think about the worldview of these old empires like Rome, which was unbelievably evil, in their view of human beings, which is chattel slavery and beasts of burden, except for their elite, as opposed to the Republican ideal, which founded the United States and has currency and other really founded Western Judeo-Christian civilization. It's a very different view of the human personality, the human mind. And people who promote that viewpoint, if you're being called a Nazi, it's because someone calling you a Nazi is trying to wreck you, destroy you, set you up for an assassination or whatever. And we need to call people when they pull that kind of stuff.
What's the true definition of a Nazi?
Strictly speaking, I would say it's someone who adheres to uh, Hitler's teachings and uh, and frequently the heritage of Hitler. For example, I'll give you an illustration. Um, we have people like this in Canada, a few here in the US probably, and a lot of them for the moment in Ukraine who march around at night in the streets with torchlights and their Nazi symbols and hold up paintings or pictures of Stepan Bandera, the Ukrainian Nazi collaborator, and I would submit that they're Nazis. Moreover, they're running around Ukraine. This is being mimicked in Estonia and Latvia and elsewhere as well. And they're tearing down statues honoring the Soviet Red Army soldiers who liberated those countries from Hitler. Those statues are being deliberately destroyed and replaced with statues of this Nazi Bandera. That's going on right now. It's been going on. And they're Nazis. I didn't
Because
name
they
the
are
Nazis, they're
adherents to
Nazis, huh? What's that?
They're adherents to Hitler's teachings?
Hitler's teachings and to his allies who conducted not just the Holocaust against the Jewish people, which was like 6 million people, but the much broader Holocaust against Europe in general and particularly the Soviet Union. Yes.
So they are people who still wanna execute Hitler's plan,
Well, they are.
basically,
They're
and they
trying
are
to.
doing it, but
Yes.
they believe in
But
doing that,
what I'm
and they're
talking about,
working on doing that, correct?
of course, yeah. And they say that, look, these people, you, if you were to look at the videos, which are available, of these clowns marching around in the dark with their portraits of Bandera and their torchlights and their little Ukrainian Nazi symbols, you would be completely repelled. It reminded me, seeing these videos of what William Shirer described, the great American historian who chronicled the rise and fall of the Third Reich, when he was in Berlin and looking out at his hotel window and watching these lines of lunatic Hitler supporters with their torchlights marching through the parks and all over the place. Scary. Scary. It's even more scary when you realize that these people are backed by British intelligence and the CIA, at least until now. We're cleaning that out. Trump is cleaning that out. You wanna know why they're attacking Trump? You wanna know why they're lying here and there and everywhere? It's because Trump is a real American patriot, and he's got the courage to fight.
He is, absolutely, and speaking of attacking Trump, I wanna switch topics slightly to Ryan Ruth.
Yes. Oh,
The attempted assassination
yes,
of
absolutely.
he tried to commit. His tie to Ukraine. What are
Yeah.
his ties to Ukraine?
Okay, well, look, I apologize because I should have started with this, today. It would have made things clear
Well, I didn't ask the
conceptually.
question till
Uh,
now, so
yeah, no, no, that's fine. The point of it is, look, what's come out in the wake of the 3rd attempt by this, Nikita what's his name? Nikita Kapak, I think is his name.
Kasap.
Huh?
Kasap. CASAP, CASAP.
Yes, CASAP, yes,
Yeah.
is direct ties to Ukraine and Ukrainian intelligence. I had a chance to read the 25-page FBI affidavit, FBI, uh, search warrant request, um, in that case, or one of them, I should say, and it's very explicit about the Ukrainian connection. If you look at Barbara Boyd's piece on PrometheanAction.com, I think I may have sent that to you last week. I'm not sure, but everyone who wants to can go to PrometheanAction.com. Barbara Boyd has a piece on the threats, the assassination attempts against Trump, the Ukraine destination, and so on. Um, the very same people who started this war in and around Ukraine are the people behind trying to kill Trump. They're the same people who orchestrated his impeachment on the Ukraine. As you may remember, the pretext was that Trump had called up the Ukrainians and said, I want this corruption investigated, blah, blah, blah. And various people whose names I won't mention at the moment uh, orchestrated his first impeachment. Um, these are the oligarchical financial families. They run British intelligence. They have run the State Department here and our secret intelligence agencies, but that's being changed. And it's a war. We'll see what happens. It's a war.
Yes, it
We have
is.
to clean them out before they kill our president.
That's right.
And and in this connection, Ukraine is functioning as a proxy for British intelligence. Now, we put out an excellent dossier, 25-page dossier called Police Dossier. It is the British who kill American presidents. And I think, Scott, you may have read that by now, but the point, it
I've
is a
read
big,
it. It's on my website,
yeah,
and I want to direct people. Many of my shows, I direct people to go read that, and I'm going to do it in my post log after we're done talking, and it'll be on there. So they should read it. People should read that. But go ahead. You were talking about Ryan
yeah.
Ruth's
Well, I
uh,
was talking initially about Nikita, who was most recently
ASAP.
arrested in this. As you may recall, he actually murdered his parents to get
Right,
the $14,000 he was going to use to buy explosives and drones from Ukraine, and was in contact with at least one Ukrainian. Um, People should understand that the fact that this little bit of intelligence about the most recent assassination attempt, the fact that that's come out is strictly a product of having a real president. It's strictly a
yes,
product of having a real president who is uh, forcing the declassification of the files on the Kennedy and RFK assassinations, the Martin Luther King assassination, the January 6th FBI riot, and so on. When uh, Crooks conducted his assassination attempt in Butler, and then uh, Ryan Routh tried his hand there in Mar-a-Lago, or that neighborhood. There was a cover-up. In Butler, Christopher Wray and the FBI covered up almost everything.
right,
Maybe some of it can be recovered, but I mean, there was just nothing uh, revealed about what they discovered, like looking at his cell phone or interviewing. There were all kinds of leads, and you should expect that. You should expect that from the Biden Obama FBI.
right,
Okay. But it's different now. Now, it should be in the case of Ralph himself, yes, he had Ukrainian connections in all directions. And he'd been over there. He tried to volunteer for the Ukrainian military. He was recruiting crazies from all over the world to join the Ukrainian military, including terrorists, in the Middle East, and just unspeakable things. Um, so that's let me phrase it this way so I can offend some people. The These assassination attempts against President Trump were paid for with your taxpayer dollars, okay? In effect, we've been providing the training, the money to the Ukrainian secret services so they can do things like this, and perhaps as many as half the, dollar value of the weapons we've transferred to Ukraine, they've sold them. They sold them on the black market to terrorist groups all over the world, to all kinds of shady operations. They're gonna come back to us. That's what's been going on, and the American media has been covering that up quite deliberately. Much of this is treason. Much of this is just vile treason of the worst
Yes,
sort.
it is.
Yeah.
And yes, they speaking of covering up, like this Nikita Kassup, you don't hear of him on the news.
Mhm,
Really? That one
mhm,
has not I haven't seen that come out anywhere. I've only came across that from articles from you guys.
mhm. Yeah, there's a
Yeah.
publication called Consortium News, which, had a great deal of material on this, um, but, uh I hope that when President Trump retires from the presidency, he starts buying major newspapers and television stations and taking them over the way Elon Musk took over Twitter. I mean, we have a corrupt, disgusting, fake news media, and the most important thing people can do now in terms of finding out what's going on is to go to our website, uh, go to your, podcast, Scott, and fight like crazy to make sense of the world. It does make sense, but you're gonna have to fight for that. And also turn off NBC, turn off, you know, cancel your subscription to the New York Times, and so on.
I agree, but I have, almost as much, disrespect for the conservative news stations like, Fox and, Newsmax.
Sure.
I
Well, I'll
mean
tell you, I agree with you, and it's a situation where, if you'll remember, it was Fox TV. Fox is run by the Murdoch or
yes,
owned by the
right.
Murdoch family.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
the story, which, I believe is credible, from the 2020 election is that it was Rupert Murdoch, the old man himself, who called into the newsroom, at Fox when the, ballot totals from Arizona, I believe it was, were being tallied, and it was not at all clear who was gonna win in Arizona, and he ordered them to claim that Biden was gonna win. To call Arizona for Biden.
I remember that.
Yeah, that's what he did, and he hates Trump, and so you've got, Fox masquerading as a so-called, conservative, new television network. There are a bare handful of people, on Fox now who are halfway human, but Tucker, of course, had to get out of there, and many others did as well. So,
Right.
you know, the real issue is don't believe. Think, think, find out what's true, okay?
Think, don't say, and that brings us back to my original question.
Mhm,
Why does it look like Putin doesn't wanna come to the table when we all we keep hearing from him directly is he does,
mhm.
and I think we've come full circle here.
Yes.
Uh, it's because you can't believe what you're hearing on the news or the mainstream media, the fake news, whatever you wanna call it. You have to seek out sources such as Promethean Action, and that kind of thing. I mean, I don't really know. I personally don't know of any source better than that. But there are other sources that might splinter off and they're telling the truth more here and there. But you're gonna have to dig out these sources. They're just not gonna come to you in your living room through the TV set.
Oh, it may
So,
come through your living room, but it's probably gonna come off you're looking up stuff on your computer and putting it on your television.
well, it can come through your TV that way, yeah. But mainly, you've got to be aggressive about it, and you've got to seek them out. You can't just flip the channel and they're going to be on there. So that is one big message to everybody. That's why it seems like Putin doesn't want to come to the table. He's already there for one thing. So, all right, I think we've used up all the time we have in a very good way, I must say. Uh, I thank you for sharing that truth because we don't get it anywhere else. So
You're welcome, Scott. Glad to be here.
I'm glad you're here. Anything else you think you should say right now? I realize you could fill hours, but anything else for this particular segment?
Well, look, it's it's an excellent time to be optimistic. It's an excellent time to be a genuine American patriot, assuming you know what that means.
Right?
We have a patriot in the White House. He deserves every possible support from the American people, and everybody should go to prometheanaction.com, pardon me, to, see what we have to do next.
Agree, and that will be on my, on the show notes for this show. So, I thank you much, Jim, and you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Scott. Bye-bye now.
See ya. Now that you've heard the rest of the story, I welcome you to do your own research, or at least know there's another version to what you've been hearing on your favorite news channels. I also highly suggest you go to prometheanaction.com and see what this source has to say and listen to some of their live and recorded discussions and maybe join in, question them, offer your opinion, which is at least as important as any of the pundits out there. And as a more educated citizen, maybe you'll want to call your congressmen and senators and visit them if you can and let them know what you think. You'll also find Promethean Action's information in the show notes and in the resources tab on my website at www.takecontrolofyourliberty.com. Also, please like, subscribe, and share so you and others can learn more about how to take control of your liberty. Because you don't want anyone doing that but you.